Good evening. I'm Thomas O'Neil-White, and we are here at WBFO's Facebook Live studios for a discussion about mental health among young African-American men. With us today is Professor Christopher St.Vil from the University of Buffalo's School of Social Work. His studies include masculinities and health, violence and trauma, and he has worked with young men on the issues of masculinity, which we will get to later. Now, Chris, first of all, how are you doing?
I'm well, Tom. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. For starters, can you give us a basic definition of toxic masculinity?
Toxic masculinity is basically masculinity that diminishes emotions, where men are socialized. Toxic masculinity is where men are socialized to not let out emotions, but they are encouraged to let out particular emotions that make them feel like they're in control. So, for example, they'll back out on emotions, but then they'll allow out anger.
And how do you see that manifest among young Black men?
Toxic masculinity, how it manifests it manifests among men in general. It manifests among men in general in terms of like substance abuse. It also manifests itself in terms of anger and fighting, acting out. But at the end of the day, what makes it toxic is that it negatively affects them as well as the people around them. Okay. But it's just an exaggerated form of masculinity. It's an exaggerated form of masculinity.
Now, what role? Now we're talking about young African-American men, and growing up, I heard this all the time, maybe not in terms of toxic masculinity, but as a problem for young African-American men. What role does hip-hop music play as an influence to young African-American men? Is it negative, positive, a little bit of both?
It's probably a little bit of both, but it's messages. It's messaging. So masculinity comes in the form of messaging. That's how men understand toxic masculinity and masculinity in general, is through messaging. So hip hop music, it plays a little bit of both. You have negative hip hop music that perpetuates sexual prowess, that violence, and then you also have hip hop music that talks about proactiveness, proactive racial socialization, that talks about responsibility and family and fatherhood as well. So it's a little bit of both. It's no different. The impact of hip hop on masculinity is no different from the impact of other music.
Now, speaking in generalities, why are men so reluctant to seek therapy?
So there are two stages to that, right? You have one aspect where they have a difficult time coming to terms with the fact that they may need help, and then the second part is when they decide to seek out help, that they have a problem actually achieving it. So for the first part, why they have a hard time coming to terms about why they need mental health is two things. For one, it's the gender socialization. It's the messages that we get from society about how men should be. And the messages that we get from society is that men should not be weak, that men should not lack control, should always be in control, and that men should not really be emotional, right? That these characteristics basically lend themselves to more feminine characteristics. So men are discouraged from actually tapping into their emotions and basically, seeking help. Secondly, within the Black community in particular, there is an aversion to therapy because, number one, therapy, because of lack of education, in the Black community, we view that as a white thing for the most part. That therapy is developed for white people, by white people, for white people, and that also that talking to someone about what goes on with you emotionally, what goes on in your house, your community, is sort of like airing dirty laundry. So there are two aspects to that. So it's an intersection of gender socialization as well as racial socialization with regard to not really talking about our problems outside of the community. And then lastly, even for those who decide that they want to engage in mental health and seek it out, there's a huge financial barrier. Black men in particular have low rates of employment, which leads to low rates of insurance. Most people who go out and get mental health or go out and get medical services, they do it through insurance that they receive through their employment. Because of the low rates of employment of a lot of Black males, that leads them to not be able to go that route. And then, so we have to kind of focus on sliding fee scales or other forms of informal support.
And we are here with University at Buffalo Professor Christopher St.Vil discussing mental health and toxic masculinity among young Black men. I want to say that this is a safe space for all. And if you have questions around the topic of mental health and toxic masculinity, please ask your questions through WBFO's Facebook page, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. Now, Chris, is this a societal issue? And if so, how?
Yes, because so messages that men in the US get from society basically tell them how they think men should be, So it's messages from society that all men get. And then basically these messages communicate a message that real men manage their own pain. And then it reinforces the disposition that to acknowledge pain and hardship, basically makes you a female. So overall, there's stages to it, right? You have the overall masculinity messages that all men get. And then as you go down, you have messages then that are culturally tailored for men in different cultures.
And trauma, it plays a role. Now, can you talk about trauma that's specific to Black men? What are they dealing with on a daily basis in their neighborhoods or just as Black men living in society?
Well, Black men so while Black men get the same messages as all men in terms of gender, when it comes down to racial messages that they get and how society thinks about them, Black men are viewed by society as, unwanted, not deserving of love, viewed as dangerous, viewed as hypersexual. And then so the stereotypes are different for Black males. So this is one thing that makes it unique among Black males that contribute to their chronic stress. Okay. Then the fact that, they have lower rates of unemployment because of prejudice in the labor market, right? They experience higher rates of incarceration. And within their community, they have threats to their personal safety, higher rates of poverty. All of these characteristics that they live through contributes to the chronic stress that they experience that serves as a sort of another layer on top of the gender issues that they experience.
And how does chronic stress impact relationships?
Chronic stress impacts relationships through the impact of their health. So, chronic stress at the end of the day leads to a number of health conditions. It could lead to hypertension. It contributes to cancer, contributes to diabetes. And, at the end of the day, that impacts the way that men engage in their daily life, including their relationships and everything else that they engage in.
Why is it important to teach kids at an early age that it's okay to cry?
Toxic masculinity is a cycle. As I stated, masculinity are messages that we get from society. For older men who internalize those messages, they continue the cycle by teaching their children how to adopt these same worldviews around toxic masculinity. So they tell their children while they're growing up, they tell them not to cry. They use emasculating language. They tell them that they're little girls if they engage in emotion by sharing their emotions, and they try to make them tough. So if we want to break the cycle, of toxic masculinity, we have to raise our young boys differently, which is by allowing them to share their emotions, allowing them to cry, actually encouraging them to let those emotions out. Because one of the issues with toxic masculinity, as I stated before, is the bottling up of these emotions, not letting them out. And that contributes to stress, that contributes to health issues. And at the end of the day, it contributes to anger outbursts.
And once again, we are here with UB Professor Chris St.Vil talking about mental health and toxic masculinity among young Black men. If you would like to ask a question centered on these topics, please go through our WBFO Facebook page. Remember, this is a safe space for all. No negativity, brothers and sisters. Now, I wanted to get into other factors, something called the PTSS, post-traumatic slavery system. How does historical trauma that we as African Americans inherit from our ancestors, how does that play a role?
It's post-traumatic slave syndrome, and it's a form of historical trauma. And historical trauma plays in because what historical trauma really is are coping mechanisms. They're coping mechanisms that were developed throughout history, beginning with African Americans when they were enslaved. And basically, they were coping mechanisms to help us deal with the onslaught of terrorism that was constantly brought upon them through these different policies such as slavery and Jim Crow. And what happens now is that the coping mechanisms that we developed during those periods, they may not be appropriate for right now. They may not be appropriate for these times that are different. And so one of those obviously that where we're focusing on now is the idea that we can't air out our dirty laundry and that counseling is not a good idea, right? So nowadays, there are a lot of Black counselors. There are a lot of Black mental health counselors, although they're underrepresented among psychologists and social workers. There is still an abundance of African American mental health counselors who can help Black people in general with their mental health issues that they're experiencing, and we have to get that information out so that basically Black people understand that there are social supports for them to address their mental health issues. But historical trauma, that's part of the historical trauma, this idea that we can't trust the system, and that's something that we need to get over.
And that includes, as you said, more African Americans in these positions, psychiatry and that, right?
Yes. So they're still underrepresented, but there's enough of them where you can reach out, and you just got to find one, right? Another piece that prevents a lot of Black men in particular and Black people in general from seeking out mental health counseling is the fact that they've had negative experiences with it as well. And their loved ones also, their friends and their loved ones speak about their experiences and they have negative experiences. But what we have to understand is counseling is like going to a supermarket in the aisle where all the cereal is, right? Counselors are not monolithic. They come in different boxes, different colors, different flavors, and you may have to try more than one out before you find a good fit. But just because you have one bad experience doesn't mean that you shouldn't go out and try to find the right one who can help you overcome your obstacles.
Exactly. That's what I've heard. I've heard the same thing. You need to find someone who fits you.
Right.
And it might take a while, but when you put in the work and you find someone that works for you, then as I say, it's all gravy after that.
Exactly. And that's formal, right? So Black men have, so on that third point that I made in terms of when they decide to find help, that it's hard for them to achieve it. Well, Black men are not monolithic, right? We have Black men that are across class. We have lower class Black men, middle class, upper class. So we have Black men who have insurance, but research shows that even those with insurance are reluctant to reach out and get counseling because of the stigma associated in our community with it, and they're embarrassed to let people know that they want to go out and get counseling or that they're receiving counseling. So for those so guys with insurance should reach out and they should be trying to shop around and find a therapist that works. But for those that don't have insurance and have a hard time paying for counseling, they themselves, they should be looking for forms of social support. informal forms of social support that can serve as a sounding board for them to talk about their emotions and what's going on inside of their head, right? So for example, going out and finding mentors, finding friends and family members that you can trust, to talk about the problems that you're having, just so you could let it out. Letting out the issues that you're thinking about and that are bothering you in and of itself is cathartic. Going out and basically engaging with young people, right? So for example, one example I think about is the Breaking Barriers program that's going on out here in Buffalo right now, where you have a lot of older men who come in and they basically are committing themselves to mentor younger men. Even that in of itself, being able to talk to a younger person and share your experience is cathartic and giving out. And, so I encourage Black men to find informal support networks where they're able to talk through some of the issues that they have until they're able to find more formal supports of professional counseling.
And since you mentioned it, let's get into it. Breaking Barriers, that's where you and I met, and you gave just an incredible speech and an incredible program, I want to say about 2 years ago, regarding mental health and toxic masculinity. Can you talk a little bit about that day?
If I could remember it, but I think I talked to those young males about expanding their masculinity and not allowing them to be in a box, right? As most men are. Once again, a lot of this traditional ideas of what masculinity are changing. They're changing. They're in the middle of changing, and which is a good thing. But we know those messages are still strong. So, in America, for example, they look to the tough guys, right? Charles Bronson, Chuck Norris. I'm older than that. The Rock. We look at the Fast and Furious guy, Vin Diesel. Like, they look to these guys who kind of are emotionally restricted, where they present themselves as emotionally restricted in the movies. We don't know what they really are. But these are the messages that kids get, that these are the cool guys and that you need to perform like this. And, in that discussion that day, if I can remember, I was just trying to explain to the young men that you need to expand your masculinity. Don't restrict it. Don't restrict it to that. And basically that the more that you restrict your masculinity to these emotions, when you subscribe to this toxic masculinity, it leads to these negative health outcomes. You don't seek out help. You become more stressful when you don't talk about your issues. When you try to avoid behaviors that are considered feminine, that it doesn't allow you to be yourself. So that's what I think we're talking about that day. And overall, toxic masculinity we're working on that, on change. We have to work on helping young men understand that we need to leave that behind in order for us to move on into a more healthy future.
And once again, we are here with University at Buffalo professor Christopher St.Vil discussing mental health and toxic masculinity among young Black men. This is a safe space for all. And if you have any questions around the topic of mental health and toxic masculinity, please ask through WBFO's Facebook page, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can. We have a couple questions from Facebook. The first one is, Chris, can you discuss toxic masculinity as it relates to homophobia and transphobia within the Black community?
Yes. So toxic masculinity, another part of traditional masculinity is homophobia, and the whole aspect of anti-femininity, avoiding everything feminine. And so, that still goes on, and that's still an ideal that's stuck to in the Black community in general, this homophobia. And young men, in the Black community are encouraged to kind of conceal that. They're not allowed to even come out with it. It's very difficult for them to come out because they're so stigmatized because of that. In the transgender community as well, they're frowned upon. A lot of it has to do with religiosity, with the heavy religiosity in the Black community, and really not trying to accept those lifestyles, because supposedly that, in the eyes of God, it's a sin, or just the overall fear of it in general, in terms of emasculation, right? it's heavy in the Black community, and it's one of the things that are beginning to change as well. I think this music video that came out from Lil Nas X has sparked a discussion even more. And I think young men who are transgendered and who are gay are also beginning to feel a lot more confident in being able to talk, to explore it and to talk more about it. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of young men who experience severe mental health issues because of the idea that they have to conceal that they can't be themselves, and there's not a lot of support to come out with it. But that's beginning to change as well.
And another question from Facebook, and this is quite topical. How does the widespread killing of unarmed Black people by police affect the mental health of Black men in general?
So when we think about stress, right, most people experience stress and acute stress, where it's basically short-lived and they can get over it. So so Black men experience acute stress, the regular stresses of every day, working, parenting, jobs, and things of that nature. Black men experience an added layer of chronic stress, where chronic stress basically is that long-term stress that doesn't stop. It keeps going. So when you talk about the police killings, Black men are afraid to come out of their house. Black men are afraid when the police are around. Black men are scared of state-sanctioned violence because nobody seems to care, and these police are not held accountable for that. And so, although everybody, we've had the verdict the other day with the Derek Chauvin verdict. Just since then, there's been other shootings, right? Ma'Khia Bryant. We've had a shooting in North Carolina. Andrew J. Brown was shot, after the verdict. And so, that is a form of chronic stress, and it makes men scared. And just even that in of itself speaks to the importance of identifying forms of support for us to be able to talk through these issues and to get it out and to express our feelings about it.
Another question from Facebook: is there a community-wide intervention for the stress of living where there's gun violence to help young Black men deal with this trauma?
No, and then that's something that we need to develop, and this is where the idea of once again, African American men need to identify forms of informal or formal social support to help them deal with these issues that impact their mental health. So I mentioned breaking barriers, right? We need more groups like that going on in the community. And what happens is what's interesting about breaking barriers is that it connects older men with the younger men, right? So although on the face of it, it looks like older men are trying to mentor younger men. Well, what I'm saying is like another aspect of it is that older men gain from interacting with the younger men and being able to speak to them about the trials and tribulations of being a man. So in and of itself, that whole relationship is reciprocal and it's cathartic. And we need to try to develop more informal supports like that. So and distill the idea of this idea that mental health and talking takes away from masculinity, right? We need to distill that. So at the end of the day, talking is not a substitute for formal counseling. That's not a substitute for professional counseling. If you're able to get professional counseling, that is the ideal, especially if you're dealing with severe mental health issues. But for those men who are afraid of counseling, a starting place is to just find networks where you can talk about issues. Another program is the fatherhood program out of the Buffalo Perinatal Prenatal Center, where they have a fatherhood program, basically where men get together to talk about fatherhood and how to deal with family and things of that nature, right? So these groups, after doing focus groups with some of those men, these men, they were elated because they were able to, number one, they had some place to talk about the issues that they were going through and not feel judged about it, right? And not feeling judged is the big thing, for men. They ended up interacting with men that had the same issues that they had, right? So they were able to explore issues. They were able to explore solutions to those issues together. And basically, I think some of those men, after coming out of that group, they moved on to they moved on to professional counseling, because within that group, they were able to realize the importance of just being able to talk through their issues.
We are discussing mental health and toxic masculinity among young African-American men with Christopher St.Vil, professor at the University at Buffalo's School of Social Work. We'd love to have you participate by asking a question through WBFO's Facebook page. This is a safe space, so please be respectful with your questions. So, Chris, where do we go from here? How do we end this stigma, and what's the starting point?
So for one, we have to educate people. We have to educate the community that, seeking out mental health will educate Black men and try to overcome that male message around men are not allowed to be emotional and men shouldn't seek help. And so we have to overcome that message. I think there's a couple of things that need to be done. Because toxic masculinity is a cycle that's passed on from generation to generation. The first step we need to do is, how do we raise our young boys? That's number one. And this whole idea around emasculating language that talks about act like a man, or stop crying, stop acting like a girl. We need to stop that. Mothers, fathers, anybody who's a caretaker of a young boy, especially young Black boys, we need to stop that. We need to do the reverse and encourage them to talk about what their feelings are. We need to encourage them to let out their emotions. And then that will begin to change the cycle of toxic masculinity. And then when we do that with those young boys, we reduce the stigma. So there's this one book here that is written by a counselor at Best Self Behavioral Services, where he wrote a book about basically demystifying the whole aura around counseling and how to make it acceptable to young children, right? So this is one step that's been taken to basically start changing the way that we teach our young boys around how to be men and what's masculine and what's not masculine. So that's the first thing, is that we have to start at the root, right? Frederick Douglass says that it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men, right? So then we build strong children by teaching them what the masculinity that we want them to perform, which is not the toxic masculinity. The next thing is, for older men, we need to continue having this conversation, and this conversation is a starter, right? And hopefully some people are listening to this, but demystifying the idea among older men that counseling makes them weak, demystifying the idea that all counselors will not understand them, letting them know that there are African-American counselors who are available, who will be more likely to understand their issues and what they've been going through and how the community impacts them. We need to talk with older men about that as much as we can. And then developing these informal support networks, developing these informal supports. Once again, formal supports are professional counseling, and informal supports will never take the place of professional counseling. But informal supports can serve as a gateway to educating men around the importance of talking out your feelings. And it serves as practice until they're able to get to the more professional grade way of counseling. So informal supports include, once again, mentoring. An older man can find a mentor, or they can mentor a young person. And in that reciprocity of social support, they are talking about issues where they can let themselves out. In those conversations, you have very intimate conversations that help a person think through what their moods, their thoughts, and behaviors are, right? So mentoring, identifying these groups, like I said, breaking barriers, the fatherhood groups at Buffalo Prenatal Center, and there are others in the community that I'm not aware of as well. But identifying these formal and informal supports for older men is crucial. And then lastly, for service providers, understanding service providers need to understand that, when you get a Black male that comes through the door, or you come in contact with a Black male that's looking for counseling, and you find out, that they may not have insurance, or they may not have the income to pay your sliding fee scale. I would encourage, service providers, especially when they're dealing with Black men, it's nothing for you to engage in a pro bono case once or twice a month. You know what I'm saying? There's nothing for you, there are ways that counselors can open the door, to especially understand the challenges that this particular group has, around trusting people, around trust, around the finances. So I think medical providers, professional counsel providers should understand that, and they should make room for this specific group, especially given the sort of chronic stress that they experience.
So with what more can providers do? Does there need to be more counselors of color?
Always could use more counselors of color, but they are out there. They are out there now. And I think I provided a link around Psychology Today that identifies some of them in this area. But we're in the COVID period. We're in the time of Zoom right now. It's Zoom mountain right now. And so you don't have to restrict your mental health provider to your geographic area, right? Now that we have Zoom, you can get a counselor in California if you like, all the way across the country. But I think what they need, a lot of men need assistance in basically navigating where those supports are, and how to engage them. And then once they figure that out, then they can go out themselves, online and then go out and throw out requests and figure out ways to do that, to develop those relationships on their own.
Speaking as a Black man, do I need a Black counselor?
Once again, it all depends, on who you are and, what you're willing and who you're willing to deal with, right? Like I said, all counselors, counselors come in different flavors, like boxes of cereal. You got Cocoa Puffs, you got Frosted Flakes, right? And you may find a white counselor, an Asian counselor, an Indian counselor that you mesh well with. But I think what really needs to happen is you need to dip your toe in the water and figure it out, right? I think, there are Black counselors who may be inappropriate. There are counselors of all cultures who may be inappropriate, but it's about finding the right fit. And once again, I'm going to go back to the idea that, don't let one bad experience, totally close you off to those possibilities, right? You might have a bad experience here, but then go ahead and still dip your toes in the water, and you'll find that good match. You will find that good match. I'm confident in that.
I wanted to quickly circle back to these programs, or this thought of mental health into schools, into public schools. How do we go about doing that?
We know guidance counselors are kind of overburdened, with guidance counselors, and some schools don't even have social workers, right? So, parents need to have the information on how to go about, searching for a counselor. So parents need to learn how to go down the aisle of, the counselor aisle and explore, these different counselors. Like I said, there's different counselors, not only men can shop around, but parents can too, right? And, you shop around for a counselor that's a good fit for your child. But in lieu of that, if you don't have the insurance, for your child to be able to get those mental health services, then you need to begin to seek out these informal supports, these informal support networks, trying to, for a mother who has a son, it may be that, he talks to the uncle. It may be that he talks to an older cousin, his grandfather, right? I don't know if I mentioned the church, but the church is a huge informal form of support in the Black community, where, especially men who are very spiritual and religious, they lean on the church, right? They lean on the church, and they lean on prayer or the church leader And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's enough for some people. But for other people, they may need some of those informal networks, such as breaking barriers or the fatherhood network, or just identifying somebody that they trust, right? With the young kids, right? In addition to telling them and demystifying the whole idea around counseling with this, we need to help our boys understand the importance of friendship, and social support, and identifying the people that they really trust, and teaching our young men to have more healthy conversations with each other, right? Teaching them the words to use, and teaching them how to not use the emasculating words, or to shun their peers when they come with issues of emotions or something to talk about. I think that's important. I think that's very important.
Do you believe that parents of today get these issues more so than the generation prior or generations prior?
I think some of them do. The way that some of us are viewing, the way that we're viewing masculinity in general is changing. The way that we're viewing masculinity in general is changing. But the first teachers of toxic masculinity are usually the parents, right? And mothers and fathers both engage in emasculating language with their sons, where especially when they come from violent communities and dangerous communities. You don't want your son to come up, there's this idea that you don't want your son to come up soft, right? You don't want him to be emotional. There are other boys in the community who are growing up tough, and you want your boy to be able to fit in, right? But I think history has shown that the boys that do come out tough are the boys that end up in a lot of trouble, right? They don't know how to talk out their feelings. They end up being hyper masculine. They don't know how to share their feelings. They don't know how to let it all out, and it stays bottled up, and they end up with these negative outcomes. And so, parents, they're beginning to understand that, but it's still a lot of that. There's still a lot of mothers, still a lot of fathers who are pushing their boys to not act like a girl, and to look at emotions as if it's a female trait, letting out of emotions. And so, I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done. I think the tide is changing at a glacial pace, slowly, but more parents need to understand what the long-term effects of letting your boy think that talking about emotions is not appropriate. I think they need to understand what the long-term effects of that are about.
Just to plug that book one more time, can you give us the author's name and where he's from?
No doubt. The book is called Always a Great Day with Counselor Dre. And the author's name is actually a father-son team. His name is Andre J.C. Stokes, who's a director at Best Self Behavioral Services, and his son Gabriel P. Stokes. So I was introduced to this book the other day before this interview, and I just thought how timely it was. So this is just a way, getting your hands on this book is a way to begin the conversation with your young boys around being able to talk to someone about their feelings and their emotions. And once again, this is the first step. This is the first step in breaking the cycle and helping children, young boys in general, understand that, trying to find pillars of informal and formal support to talk about the issues that they're having on the inside, how important it is, and how good it is for their mental health, how good it is for their mental health. And enough can't be said about this.
Now, before we wrap up, Chris, I wanted to ask you about the future. How optimistic are you that we are turning this corner and we can keep progressing from here?
The breaking barriers is just one group, right, out of that whole Obama My Keeper, the My Brother's Keeper initiative from Obama. So, from President Obama. So basically, this thing, these groups are happening all over the country. So I think, young men are beginning to have these informal supports. They're forming these informal networks. I look at the fatherhood groups as also a form of that as well. Black men in general are beginning to take mental health more seriously and understanding, that we need to speak to each other and that we need to support each other, through these times, the police shootings, overall racism, discrimination, here in COVID, just, mental health is impacting everybody just because of COVID in general. And, all the social distancing that we had to engage in that kept us from each other. Right. So, I think for the future, I am hopeful that, that this, that masculinity is going to change, that masculinity is going to change in general throughout society, but especially in the Black community, that masculinity is going to change and that something good is going to come out of all of it.
So we got one last Facebook question right before we close up. What about a woman counselor? Or would that work, or do you feel the young men would open up more to men rather than women?
No, I think female counselors are just as effective. I think, once again, and I think it all depends on who the person is, right? You might like a female counselor, you might like a male counselor, you might like a transgender counselor. It all depends. You have to shop around. But female counselors are just as good. They're just as good. I think that the main point is that, you're reaching out, and you're reaching out to these formal professionals, and that you're trying, and then you're going to figure out who's the good fit. It may be a female counselor, it may be a male counselor, but you have to figure it out. But no, they are effective. And, especially, in female counselors who a lot of them are mothers, or they had males in their life, they understand quite a lot what men are going through. So the idea that, once again, the idea that, women can't, a woman counselor, or that men counselor would be better, I think that's, I think also that's a myth. I think don't think that because of the gender parity that, that a male counselor would be best for a male client, right? Female counselors are just as good, if not better in some cases, with helping men deal with their experiences.
And we will be doing another Facebook discussion centered around racial equity next week at this time. Black Americans have been hit hard by COVID-19, but polls say many are also hesitant to get a COVID vaccine shot. What problems are the frontline healthcare workers around Buffalo experiencing? What kind of education and distribution efforts are underway? And why are they necessary? Next week, we'll have an online discussion with Dr. Kenyani Davis. She's a medical director at the Community Health Center of Buffalo, and Dr. Raul Vasquez, director of the Urban Family Practice. And that's next week at 6 here on facebook.com/WBFO News. I want to thank Christopher St.Vil for being with us. It's fantastic. I want to thank Aaron Hevern downstairs, Dave Debo, couple feet away from me. And I also want to thank my barber, Trevante Jones, for bringing this up and getting this ball rolling. Thank you, brother. Christopher, thank you for coming in, and we will see you next week.